that tends to grow up there. It's a perennial milkweed. It poisons cattle. Okay, so if one of our mama cows eats that, sufficient amount of that, they'll go down within a matter of days. It can kill a mature cow. So I consider it to be a weed. I take care of it when I can, usually by chemical means. However, my wife loves the flowers. So she likes to take pictures of the flowers. She likes that it serves as an important food source for monarch butterflies. She doesn't want me to kill those milkweed out there. So we've kind of come to a truce. I leave a few around the house, but out where the cattle spend most of their time, I kill that plant because I consider it to be a weed, and it is in my case. So again, it's all in the eye of the beholder, depends on what your situation is. In many cases, it's aesthetics. When we start talking about things like turf grass, in a vegetable garden, maybe competition is your bigger issue, but it all depends on the person and the use for that land. So when we look at our main problematic weed species, you tend to see some trends there across the country, across the globe, really. When it comes to row crops, there's about a dozen weed species that make up 95% of our problems in Texas and in most of the South. And you tend to see very similar characteristics among those. Number one, plants that grow very quickly under favorable conditions. So more often than not, we're talking about annuals in this case. So annuals have a very short life cycle, simple life strategy. As soon as they emerge, they put on rapid vegetative growth, and they tend to shade out the plants around them. So if you're growing a perennial of any sort, in my case, it's cotton, that's a perennial, it's slow growing. These quick growing weeds produce a canopy over the top of my cotton and it shades them out. You can see similar things that would potentially happen in a garden setting. Plants able to grow under conditions where most plants cannot. I'm going to give you a good example of that here in a little bit when we start looking at sandbur, but that's probably the main one that I could point to in this area. Sandbur just grows in places that other plants don't grow very well on, typically on sandy soils. And it has some unique characteristics that allow it to do that. Plants that produce large numbers of seed, they tend to increase in abundance over time, snowball essentially, turning into a bigger problem. So if I have a weed in my garden today and I don't take care of it, it might produce 1,000, 5,000, 500,000 seed, depends on the species, and become a much bigger problem the next year. Okay, so we tend to see that across a lot of the annual weed species that we tend to deal with. As far as perennials, those that produce structures like stolons or rhizomes or tubers, those are reproductive structures below ground. And so when you deal with these really tough to control perennials, you find out very quickly that you can't just walk by and hand pull that plant. Yeah, you'll remove the above ground portion, but there's things under the soil that will resprout and come back. That makes a very tough to control weed issue. Plants that have seed that can stay dormant in the soil for a long time. We have a number of those that we see on rangelands and pastures, especially where we take care of all of our weed issues this year and for the next 5 years, and many years down the road, all of a sudden we have this weed again. We thought we took care of it. We were doing a good job for a few seasons, but it turns out that seed stayed dormant in the soil for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, sometimes much longer than that. And eventually that dormancy wears off and that plant germinates and emerges, and we don't know where it came from. Well, it was there in the soil the whole time. So that can be a tough weed issue. Seed that transport easily. Could be really lightweight seed that, wind blows it. It could be seed that moves with runoff water easily. We have a number of issues south of Corpus Christi in some of the farmland that we didn't have before Hurricane Harvey. Weed issues that moved with the wind and the water from that hurricane that we're still dealing with. Then the last point here is allelopathy. So allelopathy is basically when a plant produces compounds that act as a herbicide, essentially. Good example there is bottle brush. Bottle brush produces a compound, it exudes into the soil that prevents a lot of other species, a lot of grasses, quite a few broadleaves from germinating and emerging around that plant. And that's a cool example because we now have the ability to synthesize that same compound and produce it as a commercial herbicide. We use it in corn all the time now. It's called Callisto or mesotrione. Callisto is very similar to the genus name for bottlebrush, Callistemon. So allelopathy can produce some very unique weed issues where you wind up with a monoculture, essentially. You see this in the Trans-Pecos region with creosote bush. It has some allelopathic properties, and you notice that not much else grows around creosote bush. You see hundreds of thousands of acres of nothing but creosote bush in that area. That's from allelopathy, producing a situation where that plant, that species can rise to dominance on that landscape. I mentioned plants that produce a large number of seed. The best example I can give for that is the amaranthus weeds. We have one in this area called Palmer amaranth or pigweed. As you move further north along the coast, we have one called common water hemp. It's in the same genus. But those little plants can produce thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes over 1 million seed per plant, per female. So when you see a little weedy patch like this in a field, doesn't look like much, but those few thousand plants there in that photo become millions and millions of plants the following year if that problem isn't taken care of. And that's really common amongst annual plant species. That's their main strategy in life, is just to produce enough seed that they can, have successful progeny just through sheer numbers. So pigweed, lamb's quarters, crabgrass, crabgrass will make tens of thousands of seed per plant. And even annual bluegrass, Poa annua, that grows during the winter, those little clumps of cool season annual, each of those can make 1,000, 2,000 seed each very easily. So they produce a lot of seed. Thus, you must take care of those problems well before that point so that you don't just increase that species on the landscape as time goes on. I mentioned plants that grow places nothing else will, that being sandbur. And this is what I mean. When you look at the worst grass burr, sandbur issues, typically it's going to be on a site that burns up quicker in the summer than anywhere else on the landscape. It could be a sandy soil, it could be a shallow soil. In either case, it's a soil that dries out quicker than anything else. The cool thing about sandbur is that little burr is not actually the seed. That's a capsule around the seed. Typically inside of that burr, you're going to find a couple of seed, a very small one and one that's slightly larger. That capsule holds moisture. And so on a sandy soil that dries out very quickly, sometimes too quickly for other species to germinate, that capsule is holding moisture in close proximity to that seed, allowing it to go ahead and germinate. We've also found over time that there's some beneficial microbes that are held oftentimes in that capsule that also produces a more favorable environment for that seed as it germinates. So this is a plant that grows oftentimes where nothing else can because of its abilities to hold that moisture and create that microclimate around the seed when other species just don't have that ability. We mentioned below ground reproductive structures. One of the best examples would be the nutsedges. This is yellow nutsedge here. If you look at the roots that have been washed off there, you can see two root-like structures extending down to a tuber. So those structures are actually rhizomes that then terminate in the formation of a tuber, which then produces an additional plant or additional sprout. When you see a big colony of nutsedge, most of the time they're all interconnected. So it's all one big colony. It may have started from one plant even. But that's not a problem that you can solve with hand pulling. You have to unearth all of that structure, all of those structures below ground, and allow them to desiccate and die, or use a systemic herbicide that would move down into those structures and kill them. Otherwise, you're going to keep having a nutsedge problem, because once you remove the upper part of the plant, it could resprout from that rhizome, or it could resprout from that tuber. So these perennial issues are very, very difficult to deal with. When it comes to seed that stays dormant in the soil for a long time, cocklebur is a really good example. Very similar to sandbur in that capsule is not the seed itself. That capsule with the little beaked spines on it, that's just the container for the seed. And in the case of cocklebur, there's two very different size seed in there, one very small, one very large. The small seed typically comes up very soon after that seed is matured and dropped out in the soil. The large seed stays dormant for a long period of time. And we've had pastures that we've completely cleaned of cocklebur problems wind up becoming an issue many years down the road because those larger seed are still there and eventually they will germinate and emerge. And sure enough, they do. The other thing about cocklebur is that capsule hangs itself in the hide of livestock, wildlife. Sometimes my sister, when I was a kid, I would throw them in there and they transport really easily. Okay, so when we take cattle off of a weedy property, we put them onto my neighbor's nice clean pasture. A lot of times they're bringing seed with them, creating additional weed issues. A lot of times we transport the seed ourselves. So if you're borrowing gardening equipment, mower, tractor, things like this, be aware that you might be transporting seed, weed issues. So when you bring in a piece of equipment, it has debris on the deck, make sure you clean it off. And then before you give it back, clean it off as well. You don't want to donate problems to your neighbors and you don't want to take problems from your neighbors either. But this happens a lot in agriculture. We have weed issues that will show up out of nowhere. And typically it's tied to equipment moving from other parts of the country that kind of follows the harvest season down here. All right, let's talk weed ID next. There's a lot of good resources out there when it comes to identifying weeds. You can use plant keys. I've got one somewhere around here. Well, I can't find it right now. I've got a good plant key for this part of the state. It's about this thick. Okay, it's thousands and thousands of pages, and I really hate to use it because typically you have to have a microscope and you have to remember a lot of terms that you don't use in everyday life to be able to navigate that. The best guides for me are those that have a lot of photos in them. If I can flip through photos, sometimes I have one for Central Texas that's actually grouped by flower color. So it has a purple flower. I'm going to go to the purple flower section. That works really well, especially for the more common plants that you run into. Every now and then you'll find something that just isn't in any guide, but 90% of the time it's going to be in one of these nice regional guides. And two that I've found work the best for me are these. They're both from Texas Tech Press. First one is Field Guide to the Broadleaf Herbaceous Plants of South Texas. The next is Weeds in South Texas and Northern Mexico. The second one includes some grass species in there as well. The first one's broadleaf weeds only. But these have been a big help to me. Typically, I've got one sitting around me, but I have too many papers on the desk. I'm not native to South Texas. I'm from San Angelo and Fort Stockton before that. So I've had to learn a lot of species that we just didn't have where I grew up. But when it comes to South Texas, these are good guides. I think they're both still in press. Pretty easy to find. Last year, I was able to still find them on Amazon. I haven't checked lately. But if you want to take a look at these, please check them out. A lot of good high quality photos in there and good descriptions as well. Now, as you're navigating most plant guides, especially if they have any kind of plant key written into that, you're going to notice a lot of very specialized language used to describe various parts of the plant. When I took plant taxonomy, however many years ago, I knew most of those terms. It disappears fast if you're not a taxonomist, okay? Whenever I'm trying to key something out, it's not because I remember all the various names for leaf shape. It's because I have Google now. So I can Google what those terms mean and find it fairly quickly. But when you start working your way through a plant guide and it says hastate shaped leaves, I don't remember what that is. I typically have to look it up. But there is a lot of various descriptors for things like leaf shape. Leaf margin is important. So a smooth margin would be an entire margin. A toothed margin might be dentate, crenate, doubly serrate, serrate. You know, there's a lot of different descriptors that could be used there, but that is an important feature on the plant, that being the edge of the leaf or the leaf margin. Leaf tips are important too. With broadleaf plants especially, that angle at the tip, acute, obtuse, a number of weed species have that little point at the end. So it's a rounded leaf tip, but right at the vein or the midrib, it becomes pointed. That's an acuminate tip. It's another one of those that once or twice a year I have to Google to make sure I have that right. But leaf apexes or leaf tips are important. One of the most important diagnostics when it comes to broadleaf plants is the leaf arrangement on the stem. So as you move up the main stem or one of the main branches on that plant, how do the branches come off of that? How do the leaf petioles emerge from that branch? Are they alternate as you move up the stem? Are they opposite, meaning you have pairs that actually come from either side of the stem? Or are they whorled around the stem where you might have 3, 4, 5 attachment points or branches from a single point on the stem? That is very, very important. When I get weed ID photos, you know, my email, if I can't see the leaf arrangement, a lot of times I don't even go any further, because that is so important that you be able to identify that, and that typically will lead you to a fork in the road in a plant key. The inflorescence or the flowering structure of the plant is also very, very important. A lot of our grasses have a panicle. Okay, you can see that arrangement in that middle grouping. Things like guinea grass, like Johnson grass, they have a panicle. Some may be spike or raceme, but again, if you're looking through a plant key or a plant guide, you're probably going to hit that point where you need to differentiate what that inflorescence type is. What is that flower cluster structured as? Grasses are hands down more difficult to identify than broadleaf plants. If I have a seed head on a grass, that helps a lot. But even then, if you're not just a dyed-in-the-wool grass expert, grasses are difficult. And luckily, we have a couple in College Station that I can send specimens to, but grasses are difficult across the board. Sedges are even more so. With grasses, we are looking at the inflorescence type. Is it a panicle? Is it a spike? What have you? One of the key characteristics also is one that you don't find in broadleaves, and that's called the ligule, which is basically where the leaf comes off of the main stem of that grass plant. At that juncture between the leaf blade and the leaf sheath that actually encloses the stem, some plants will have a structure there called a ligule. I think this is a British diagram here. They call it a lingule. It's a little different, but the presence or absence of that structure, sometimes it's a membrane, sometimes it's just some hairs. The length of those hairs, really minute details there make a big difference when it comes to grasses, which is why I'm not good at identifying grasses. Okay. A good guide that has lots of photos of the seed head will do you a lot of good when we need to get into the real nitty-gritty details of a species that we're having a tough time with. I'm going to speed dial a couple folks in College Station. It is that hard. One of the first things you can do before we get into even some of these descriptors that we just touched on is just identify broad groups. Okay, is it a grass? Is it a broadleaf? Or is it a sedge? Grasses and sedges can be confusing. Sedges are very grass-like in nature, but they physiologically are nothing like a grass. So when it comes to herbicides especially, that makes a big difference. When you look at a seedling in your garden, before you are able to identify species, you should be able to identify at least, is it a grass, a broadleaf, or a sedge? That's going to drive some really important management decisions from that point on. So I'm going to run through a few examples here. We've got two photos of newly emerged seedlings here. Are they grasses, broadleaves, or sedges? Well, on the left-hand side, you can see each of those seedlings emerges with a little spike. Okay, that spike is telling you that's a monocot. It has one leaf, one seedling leaf. So we don't know if it's a grass or a sedge exactly at this point, but we know it's a monocot. On the right-hand side, you can see that seedling emerged, and it has two seedling leaves that are opposed. That's a dicot. That means it has two cotyledons, two seedling leaves. That's a broadleaf plant. That could be a great big tree when it grows large, or it could be a little bitty broadleaf weed when it's mature. We don't know at this point. We don't really know much about it, but we at least know that it's a broadleaf. As those seedlings put on a little more growth, start to put on more true leaves, we can start to tell more differences here. So we got a dicot embryo over on the upper left-hand side. Hopefully you can see, let me see here, if I can find a pointer. Yeah, so hopefully you're able to see that red dot. These structures here that I'm outlining, these are the cotyledons. Those are those seedling leaves that we just looked at in the prior slide. Okay, so these aren't true leaves. These leaves here are the true leaves. These are the leaves that you'll actually see as that plant goes on to grow and develop. These seedling leaves typically will slough off before too long. So this is the first true leaf. This is the second true leaf. Very easy to diagnose at this point that we're dealing with a dicot. With this grass embryo over here, we have our initial seedling leaf here, and then this is a true leaf moving up the stem. You notice that they're ranked in twos, so they're opposed here. That is a diagnostic to tell us that that's grass. With a sedge, you've got a seedling leaf. We have some true leaves starting to emerge from that whorl. It may not be apparent at this point that that's a sedge. As we go a little further in these slides, you'll see the ranking of those leaves. They actually come off in groups of 3. That would tell you it's a sedge. Oh, got to get rid of my pointer here. Okay. The cross section of the stem from basically seedling stage all the way through maturity can tell you a lot. Most of our broadleaf species are going to be round in cross section when you slice that stem at a 90-degree angle. Some may be square. Some of our mint species actually have a square cross section, but most are round essentially. Grasses tend to be kind of a flattened oval, okay? And that also shows you, when those leaves come off in ranks of 2, you have a leaf that'll come off on this side of that flattened cross section and a leaf that'll come off on this side. Whereas sedges have a triangular cross section, and you notice that the leaves are coming off in ranks of 3. The venation of the leaf, it's an important diagnostic. It may not tell you the difference between a sedge and a grass, but certainly broadleaf from monocot. Your grasses and sedges, the veins are all parallel within the leaf. They're all running next to one another in the same direction. Whereas with a broadleaf species, the pattern of the veins in that leaf can take on a lot of different forms, but typically they're going to be somewhat netted. Okay, they might be pinnate, where you have a single midrib or a mid vein, and then you have multiple veins that come off of that on either side. Could be palmate, arranged like my hand, but they're not typically going to be parallel. There are a few exceptions to that. Comelina or dayflower is a monocot or a dicot that is parallel veined, but primarily parallel veination is going to be in your monocots, so your sedges or your grasses. Same thing with the overall leaf shape. If it's a sedge or a grass, it's pretty simple. Okay, there's not a lot of variation upon that. They're long, pointed leaf blades. Okay, when you get into broadleaves, you have a lot of variability, a lot of different types of lobing, different leaf margins, things like that, toothed, what have you, but there's a lot of variation in the broadleaf world. And then, like we mentioned, the ranking of the leaves on the stem is going to be one of your main diagnostics for whether something's a grass or a sedge. Your grasses are going to be ranked in 2s, so you have a leaf coming off on this side of the stem and a leaf coming off on the other, opposite from that. Whereas with a sedge, typically your leaves are going to come off from the sides of that triangular stem. Okay, so they're ranked in threes. Flowers tell you a tremendous amount, especially with broadleaves, because you have a lot of variability in broadleaf flowers, different colors, different structures, different variations on what a flower can and can't be. When you get into the grasses and sedges, there's not as much variation and the flowers are microscopic. So going back to what I said about grasses, especially where you really need a microscope, those seed heads contain so many tiny flowers in most grass species that it's very difficult. But the overall structure of the flower or the seed head, sometimes color can be a slight diagnostic with grasses or sedges, but typically you can't get into a lot of detail with those flowers. But with broadleaves, you can. Typically very large flowers, very showy flowers. There's a lot there to look at, and there's a lot there that you could use to identify the plant. So hopefully you'll be able to look at seedlings in your garden, especially, and at least make a decision, okay, is this a grass, is it a broadleaf, or is it a sedge? That's a really important thing to be able to do, especially if we're talking about herbicides, because we have herbicides that are selective for perhaps grasses and not broadleaves, or vice versa. We have herbicides that are effective on sedges, but are very safe on anything else. You need to be able to identify broadly what that plan is, so that you can start to think about a plan for remediating that problem. Another thing you need to be able to do is also determine whether it's an annual or perennial. If it's an annual, it's fairly simple. We could just pull it. We could use a hoe and chop it out. If it's a perennial, that might just make that plant mad. Okay, if I pull it, I might have 10 resprouts that come up from that same spot. That might require me to actually dig it up, or it might require me to use a systemic herbicide. So knowing annual versus perennial, very, very important. Your annuals, fairly simple. They have one job and one job only, and that is to reproduce before they die. Okay, and they die within a season, typically. So they get up quick. If it's a summer perennial, it's going to emerge during the spring. In this part of the country, it's early spring, when conditions are good, before it gets hot, before we get into our typical summer drought. So they produce a lot of leaf very quickly, produce a good thick canopy. They shade out their competition in the case of a weed, and they're going to produce a lot of progeny, a lot of seed in a very short period of time. They don't produce a big extensive root system because they don't need to. By the time we get to the middle of summer, most of our summer annuals have already done their job. They produce seed. If they die, they die. Okay, they've already produced that seed. Their progeny will come up later in the fall, the next spring, maybe a few years down the road, whatever the case may be. So everything we do with an annual is centered around preventing that plant from going to seed. We just want to end it now before we have to deal with new seedlings coming up next season. And because it doesn't have much of a root system on it, that could be as simple as just going out and hand pulling it. Perennials are much more difficult. Again, rhizomes, tubers, stolons, anything below ground that can come back. Mesquite, prime example. Huisach, all these brush species that we have growing around here, they're so common because they're resprouters. So anything you do to them outside of using a bulldozer and uprooting them essentially produces a lot of resprouts. They come back from the root system, and they come back with more sprouts than they started with. We have to do things that get rid of that root, whether it's chemical or mechanical. They do have that large, extensive root system because they have to come back year after year after year. We're not as worried about seed production with a perennial. And in the case of herbicidal control, sometimes we delay herbicides until these plants start to flower because that's a little more effective time to kill them. They might make some seed before we get that herbicide out, but we're more concerned about getting the herbicide into the root system to make sure that plant doesn't come back again. So it depends which species you're dealing with. There's a lot of variability out there depending on what we're worried about, but we're not as worried about seed production. these plants are producing a lot of other structures. They're putting a lot of energy into their root system because they do have to come back the next year. They're not putting as much energy into seed production as an annual. Digging up some roots will tell you a lot. We're looking at annuals in this case. There's not much there. Small fibrous root system in the case of that annual grass on the left, with that winter annual on the right. It's a broadleaf. It has a little tap root, a little bit of fibrous root around that, but it's not extending to any great depth. There's not much there. These are annuals. We could hand pull them. We could burn them. A lot of herbicides are effective on an annual weed species because we're just killing the top of the plant. We're not worried about the below ground coming back to bite us. When you dig up a weed and you see things like this, or if you try to dig up a weed and an hour later you're still digging and still bringing up root, that's probably a perennial. Things like rhizomes, things like tubers. We have one out in hayfields in this area called Texas bull nettle, and it'll have a little 12 to 24 inch bit of plant above ground, but if you dig it up, it has the root system the size of an oil drum. It's a tough perennial, and it's tough because of those below ground resources. So when you see structures like this, when you see big extensive root systems, you know that you're dealing with a bigger problem. The good news is, for me in row crops, for you perhaps in a lot of garden settings, if you're doing frequent and regular tillage operations, perennials don't tend to persist very long. When you're doing soil operations, whether it be tillage or ripping or things like that on a regular basis that break up these rhizomes or these big extensive root systems every year, you typically don't see perennials take hold in those areas. You tend to see mostly annuals. When we back off on our tillage in an area, then you'll start to see more and more perennials start to move back into that area. So any questions on that before we move into more management focused items? If not, I'll keep going here. So weed management for a lot of folks means a jug of Roundup. And we're going to talk about that too, but there's more to it than that. Okay, herbicides are part of that equation in some settings, but there's a lot of things we can do cultural in nature to prevent or discourage weeds from growing in an area. There's some biological tools here and there. We'll discuss those. There are none that I'm aware of that are really all that relevant for what we're talking about today. And then there's always mechanical means. That's more of my hobby at home, is just hand pulling weeds, to be honest with you. There's a lot of good to be done there, and it's very effective and it's very useful in a lot of settings. So we have a lot of different options available. It's not just a herbicide. So your cultural methods, these are basically anything you do that creates that environment that is unfavorable for weed growth and development. So one of the prime examples here is going to be your turf grass. That starts very early on when you're choosing what species or what hybrid or what variety you're going to plant or sprig or move in, flats, what have you. There's a lot of expense at that point. It behooves you to spend a little time and make sure you're picking a variety or a species that is adapted to that environment, that's going to grow out really well and be very competitive. Out front of our office, we have Floratam, and managed appropriately in this environment, Floratam is beautiful. It's so thick. We don't use herbicides on this lawn, or very rarely do we, because it's so competitive. Bermuda grasses are great, especially out, we start looking at hayfields and pastures. Bermuda grasses are very adapted to this environment. We have a lot of hybrids available that could be used to prevent a lot of weed issues from ever becoming an issue, because it's so thick and very competitive. And then after you have a species established, maintaining that to produce as thick and competitive a stand as you can is also important. So That's your fertilizer program. That's your irrigation. Any cultivation that goes into the, a more manicured bed, things like that. But again, all these are centered around creating as thick, as competitive a stand of your desirable plants as you can to keep the weeds from ever establishing. Prevention goes a long way. We touched on this when we mentioned equipment, but also if you're bringing in seed, if you're bringing in soil, mulch, compost, make sure you're bringing in clean stuff. I helped my mom put in a garden in San Angelo years back, and we brought in truckloads of cheap topsoil from a good friend, but she's been dealing with the aftermath of that ever since. It was chock full of weed seed. It came from a creek bottom outside of town that has all the diversity of weed species in the San Angelo area in one spot. So we basically brought those problems onto her property. So make sure what you're getting is good quality material and it's clean. And then lastly, like we said, equipment sanitation is really, really important.
A couple of questions for you, Josh.
Yes, sir.
So hedges seem to be stiffer to cut, and edges would also cut us. And then the same person, hedges seem to be more difficult to pull out by hand.
Can you repeat that? I think I missed something.
So sedges seem to be stiffer to cut, and the edges would also cut us. Sedges are more difficult to pull out, or waterweed, reeds, and cattails sedges.
So
questions there.
Yeah, I caught sedges are more difficult to cut. And I agree, especially we have a few different species, but we've got some annual sedges, green flat sedge and rice flat sedge, that are really fibrous in their leaf. So when you run a mower across them, it doesn't cut clean. It kind of tears. I don't know a better way to put that, but it doesn't look very good. And they're very hard to pull. If it's really hard to pull, you're probably dealing with a perennial sedge. Okay, like a purple nut sedge or yellow nut sedge are the main ones that we're going to see. The annual sedges, again, it's an annual, so they don't have a lot there to root them in. When we get a little further into this, we're going to touch quite a bit on sedge-specific products, and there are some herbicides that will do a lot of damage to those sedges. Annual, perennial, doesn't matter. There's a lot of tools we can use, but when it comes to a perennial sedge issue, herbicide or just completely uprooting the bed is about the only thing I know to do, because there is so much root system down there. I've got a good one in my front yard right now that's like, there's got to be 1,000 plants in the size of like a hula hoop. It's just one big old colony. And one of these days I'm going to kill it, but it's going to be with a herbicide. But I'm never going to hand pull my way out of that situation.
Do they like sandy dirt?
Yes.
What kind of dirts do they grow best in is, I guess, the question.
Well, you're going to find nut sedges in all kinds of soil textures. We've got a lot of black clay in this area. If it stays wet enough, long enough, you're going to see sedges. Okay. If you've got, like some of these row crop areas outside of town where it's just rain fed, we don't stay wet that long. We have some wet weather in the spring, some in the fall, not much in between. We don't really see sedges in those areas, but well-watered areas, that's typically where you're going to find them more often than not. As you move further up the coast, with the annual sedges, I tend to see them on high clay soils, not so much in the sandy areas, but that's just the annual sedges. Perennial sedge, though, I've seen them sandy, clay, all areas in between, but the main thing seems to be well-watered areas, or poorly drained might be a better way to put it.
Sultan weed root, that's a term I'm not familiar with. S-U-L-T-O-N?
S-U-L-T-A-N?
O-N.
O-N.
a root. It was on your slide about 2 or so back.
Here.
One more. Right up there.
Oh, stolen. Stolen.
Stolen.
Yeah, so good example here for stolons and rhizomes are somewhat similar. One's above ground, one's below ground. But think about Bermuda grass. You know those runners that you see above ground? Those are stolons. Bermuda grass also has rhizomes. Very similar, but they grow underneath. You're not going to see them till you dig them up. But it's a reproductive creeper, more or less, above the soil surface.
Are they like these wiry fibers? Is that what these are? Those real fibrous roots?
They're not terribly fibrous, but it's basically the analog of what I show here is a rhizome, but above ground, above the soil surface. With Bermuda grass, it's not quite as thick and aggressive as that, but you'll get those runners that'll. I mean, I've got some that'll creep onto my porch that are like 10 foot long, creeping out of that Bermuda grass turf. That's a stolon if you see it above ground. Below ground, it's a rhizome. But either way, they're both reproductive structures. The stolons above ground can actually root from each of the nodes or the little joints or knuckles along that stolon. So if it comes into contact with the soil surface and you get a little bit of moisture, it'll root from that point and establish itself, which is usually a good thing if you're trying to get Bermuda grass to cover over.
Okay.
If it's moving into your garden, I guess it's a weed at that point.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll mention biologicals very briefly, mostly because I don't have a lot to talk about, but these would be basically your insect or disease tools used to manage weeds. And there are cases of these being harnessed as a weed management tool. Typically, though, they're not terribly effective, and they're also, especially in the case of insects, very host specific. Okay, and there's a few of them out there. Musk thistle weevil. There's also a puncture vine beetle that we've used in West Texas. The problem with that a lot of times is that insect will only feed on one species, which is on the surface good, right? If you want this insect to eat this weed species that you happen to have a lot of, that's great. With puncture vine beetle, we've done that. But what tends to happen is you release a lot of those beetles, they eat your weeds, but then when that species is gone, the population of that insect just crashes and they don't come back. And so the next year the weed comes back, you have to release more of that biological or an insect in this case. So these tools exist, but for the average person, probably not viable as a sole method of weed management. I remember years back mention of these mycoherbicides or pathogenic materials used to manage weeds. Might be a thing. I haven't really heard a lot in the last few years about the development of those tools. So, in the biological category, I really don't have a lot to say. Mechanical, though, we do. Okay. Hand pulling works really well if you got the time, or like me, if you're just bored on the weekend. We also apply here on the farm a lot of herbicide. Old farm manager came up with that term, and I've used it ever since. And we send a crew of guys out to the field in a truck to apply herbicide, which means they're going to work their rear ends off with a piece of metal on the end of a stick to get rid of that weed problem instead of spraying, because a lot of times that's not an option for us. It works really well. Broadcast cultivation can be a tool for you, whether that's cultivating with sweep structures, which is more of your horizontal blade moved through the soil, knives, harrows. There's a lot of different ways to work the soil. The problem with that is, as a weed scientist, if I want to stir up a new flush of annual weeds on a site so that I can put a study out, that's the first thing I do is I go out and I till it up. Because when you disturb that soil, you're also bringing up a lot of weed seed that was, well below the area that it might have normally germinated from. So broadcast cultivation can be a tool, but a lot of times that's not going to be a good long-term strategy. It can be used to solve a problem, perhaps at planting time or just before you plant. But the next time you get rain or you turn on the sprinkler, all that disturbed soil is going to be where most of your weed problems come from. So it can stimulate additional flushes of weeds. Just mowing actually works fairly well in some situations, especially if you've got, say, in a lawn setting, could be pasture, could even be a hayfield. If I've got some annual broadleaf weeds out there that are significantly taller than the grass that I'm interested in, Bermuda grass in the case of a hayfield, I can run a mower out there and I can knock those flowers off those weeds and at least keep them from reproducing. Now, it's not a long-term strategy. That's not going to kill that plant, but it does at least reduce the competition and it takes the reproductive capacity out for that plant. In a lawn setting, a lot of times we can mow our way out of a bigger problem, but we're not going to eliminate the issue with the mower alone. And what you'll also see in the case of a lot of our grassy weeds, these introduced blue stems in this area are a good example of this. They'll grow very tall and upright initially, but every time you mow it, that plant gets a little lower and lower to the ground, and eventually you have blue stem that is reproducing at about 2 inches of height because it's just flat now. So you can't ever reach it with the mower at this point. They do adapt as you disturb them. So mowing has some uses, but just like cultivation, it's not a long-term sole strategy for you. Herbicides have a lot of uses. It's not right for every situation. We rely on them heavily for larger acreages because it's hard to beat. I mean, for a few dollars an acre, a lot of times we can control a weed that would cost $50 to $60 to do through mechanical means. So we use a lot of herbicides at scale. At smaller scale, gardens, lawns, things like that, they do still have some uses, but probably aren't going to be your sole tool. So basically, that's any material used to suppress or kill weeds. Typically, this is going to be by interrupting or halting normal growth processes within the plant. More often than not, these are synthetic materials. There are some natural or materials that are marketed as natural weed killers out there. Corn gluten meal, mustard seed meal, the homebrew vinegar, salt kind of concoction, which actually works quite well for annual weeds. Those would be your natural products. Corn gluten meal and mustard seed meal, we've actually looked at years ago for pre-emerge. Didn't see a lot of use there. And it's kind of interesting because since then, one of my compadres had a grad student that actually did some work with mustard seed meal and found, in a lab setting, it actually works as a really good pre-emerge. The problem is when you get to like a lawn scale area, you'd have to haul in a whole trainload of this stuff to make it work. So in theory, sometimes these things look good, but in practice, they really don't work out. This is some work my old boss did with corn gluten meal for crabgrass, comparing that to a standard herbicide like pendimethalin, and really didn't see anything there, even at very, very high rates. I like this slide because the bottom right-hand photo is the 3x rate, so 3 times the prescribed rate for corn gluten meal. We were putting so much corn gluten meal out there, it actually fertilized the weed. So you notice the crabgrass looks healthier there than it did in the untreated. And so that's the kind of the funny thing you deal with here. In a lab setting, yeah, you can get corn gluten meal up at a high enough concentration that it will control some weeds, but in your lawn, not so much. When you look at standard commercial herbicides, we want to make sure we're on a even playing field here when it comes to labeling. Everybody understands that sticker on the container, typically it's kind of put together as a book almost. You peel it away, you see many pages of instructions under there. It's not just, hey, maybe read this before you use it. The stuff in that label is the law, okay? The rate, the timing, the personal protective equipment that you might have to wear. Maybe it's gloves, maybe it's goggles. Re-entry intervals, a lot of folks forget that when you apply a pesticide to your lawn, there might be a re-entry interval that says, hey, no kids or dogs for 4 hours. Those things are really important. So I get these calls a lot. Hey, I bought this stuff. How much do I use? How much do I put in the tank? And it's like, hey, the instructions are on that container, and I know you didn't read them. So take some time, in the heat of the day, read the label before you apply anything. And if you're like me, I'm reading it in the store at Home Depot. I want to make sure I'm comfortable with everything in that label before I spend the money on it. So familiarize yourself with the label. You want to know what you're applying, right? I can't imagine that this person knew they had Roundup in the tank when they put out all that spray and that pattern on the lawn. Or if they did, they didn't know what Roundup did. They made a disaster out of that lawn. I got to believe that reading a label would have solved that problem. So understand what you're using and how to use it safely. When we refer to herbicides, there's a few different ways we can do this, and it's all on that label, by the way. You've got your trade name or your product name. And so we're going to use an example here in a second of something called pendulum. Then you've got your common name, which is kind of a shorthand version of the chemical name for that compound, which is pendimethalin in this case. Then you have the full chemical name, which is a big mess of numbers and letters, which is not of a lot of use to most of us. But this is what it'll actually look like on the label affixed to the container or the bag or whatever the case may be. This is pendulum. It's a pre-emerge. We're going to talk about it a few times as we go through this. Use in turf grasses, ornamentals, landscape. You can see all the different uses here. So you've got your trade name at the top. Down below in the fine print, you can see the active ingredient, and that's listed by the common name, which is pendimethalin, or next to that, you have the full chemical name. A lot of times when we're talking about ingredients, most of the time I'm going to use the common name. That's going to be the shorter name. I don't want to sit here and say N1-ethylpropyl 3,4-dimethyl 2,6-dinitrobenzenamine. It's easier to say pendimethalin, or we might refer to the product name like pendulum. Another thing to notice, where it says active ingredient here, you can scroll over and see, okay, it's 37.4% active ingredient. And then down below where it says total, it also tells you 1 gallon contains 3.3 pounds of pendimethalin. That's important when you're shopping around for herbicide. A lot of the products on the shelves at big box stores or nurseries, things like that, these are not under patent anymore. There hadn't been a lot of new herbicides in 20 some odd years. So there's a lot of generics, a lot of different companies making the same herbicide. If you're comparing product A to product B, and you're looking at the price per unit only, a lot of times you're missing out, because product A may contain more active ingredient than product B, so it's going to be a little more expensive. But in the long run, it might be cheaper, okay, because you're getting a more concentrated product. So when you're comparing things, look at that gallons or pounds per gallon that's listed on the label. For dry products, you can just look at the percentage, okay, to compare which one's more concentrated than the other. Last thing on your label, at least on the front page of the label, you want to pay attention to is the signal word. At the very bottom here, you see caution. Okay, that actually does tell you something. That's not just a generic term. Those signal words are important. This basically goes in descending order from the most toxic to the least toxic. We've got danger, poison. If you see that on a label, my advice is don't use it. Okay. We have very few pesticides that still have danger, poison on the label. I can think of one that I use in row crops, and that's it. Most of those have been phased out over time because they're highly toxic by any route into the body. One step below that would be danger. That could be something that causes severe eye damage or skin irritation. Quite a few herbicides today you'll still see that have danger on them. But if you see danger, poison, and you see the skull and crossbones, that is something to be very, very hesitant to use in my case. But danger, you will see a lot of herbicides that, maybe if you don't have eye protection on, you get them in your eye, they can cause a real problem. You'll see that on a lot of today's herbicides. One step below that is warning. That's moderate toxicity, orally, dermally, or through inhalation, moderate eye or skin irritation. And then beneath that is caution, which is what we just saw on the pendimethalin label. At a minimum, just about every herbicide that I'm aware of has caution, at least on the label. I can think of one pesticide off the top of my head that doesn't have any signal words on it, and it's an insecticide. But just about everything will have a signal word on it. If it's caution, that's slight toxicity. That's kind of the lower level within this scheme here. Other things you're going to want to pay attention to on the label, precautionary statements, human or animal hazards if you're using in an area where you've got pets or livestock, or you got kids. I've got 2 little bitty ones that run around my yard. A lot of things I don't use because of that, because I know they're going to be rolling in that grass. One of them's probably going to eat some dirt. So we really watch what we use in that scenario. Environmental hazards, if you've got a drainage behind your house or you're up next to a creek, a stream, things like that, some products should not be applied near aquatic areas or areas that are likely to run off into bodies of water. Chemical hazards, give you a good example, glyphosate, Roundup, should not be used in galvanized tanks. Galvanized steel reacts with glyphosate and causes some real issues. So you want to make sure that you read the label so you know there's an incompatibility with that material. First aid, statements of practical treatment, re-entry intervals. There's a lot of important stuff on the label. And we haven't even gotten into the meat and potatoes of it, which is the label tells you what weeds that product will control and at what dose and at what timing. But all of this other stuff is much more important than that. You need to read these things first, and then let's find out how to use it. Another important thing to understand about herbicides is selectivity. So I'm going to pick on Roundup a lot just because it's something a lot of us are familiar with. Roundup is a non-selective herbicide, meaning if you put it on green plant material, whether it's a grass or a broadleaf or an annual or a perennial, it doesn't really care. It has activity on just about any plant species out there. It may not kill them all, but it's going to hurt just about all of them. I don't know of too many that will survive Roundup. It's non-selective. We're going to talk about a few herbicides that are very selective. Some control only grasses, and they do nothing to broadleaves, or vice versa. There's a few in here that are very sedge specific. So selectivity is really important because we exploit those selective properties in certain situations. If I have a grass lawn and I have broadleaf weeds, that's a problem I can solve very easily with a selective herbicide that only kills broadleaves. If I have a broadleaf ornamental garden and I've got Bermuda grass growing in it, I can use a graminicide, which is selective for grasses, to kill Bermuda grass while leaving my ornamentals, my broadleaves, safe. The movement of the herbicide in the plant is also important. If we're talking about an annual, something that just kills the top of the plant is okay. But like we said, with the perennial, that's not a good scenario. That's not a good strategy. We need to kill the entire root system of that plant. So we want a translocating or a systemic herbicide. Contact herbicides would be more along the lines of that vinegar, salt, homebrew type spray. Okay, so where you spray the plant, that's where it's going to do its job. Everywhere that water-based solution lands on the leaf, it's going to burn that tissue, and it might kill it if it's just an annual. If you use that homebrew solution on a tough perennial, it's not going to kill it. It's just going to remove the top of the plant. It's going to dry and desiccate those tissues, but it's going to come back from the root. That's where we would use something systemic. Could be glyphosate, could be any number of other options, but something that you spray on the plant that then gets into the vascular tissue of the plant and moves down to the root and kills it there. This herbicide here, paraquat, is, in the way that it acts, it's very similar to that homebrew vinegar solution type herbicide. You can see the soybean plant was sprayed, although incompletely, but everywhere that spray landed on the leaf, it killed that tissue. So we could kill that plant if we got good enough coverage on it, and if it was an annual. If that was a perennial, all we would do is just burn the top of it off and it would come back. But a systemic herbicide can overcome those issues by getting down into the vascular system, the xylem and the phloem of the plant. Basically, the phloem is the tissue that's moving carbohydrates, energy from the leaf down to the root primarily. It can also go in the other direction. The xylem is the vascular system of the plant that's moving water from the root system up to new growth. Depending on the herbicide, it can move in either or both of those systems. If we're trying to kill a perennial weed with a foliar spray, we really want it to move in the phloem. But things like atrazine, which we still use in lawns quite a bit, they actually moves primarily in the xylem. So it moves up to the top of the plant. It concentrates in the growing points. Herbicide persistence is really important too. If you have a bed or an area on your property where we might change what we're doing next year. So let's say it's a garden of species X this year, and next year it could be a garden of species Y, or it could be an ornamental the year after that. In my world, it's crop rotation. What is a cotton field this year might be sesame next year. It might be, I don't know, hemp 3 years down the road, or it could be corn. I mean, there's a lot of different species grown from season to season. A herbicide that I use this year that's safe with what I'm growing now might persist in that soil long enough to hurt the next crop whenever we change species. Luckily, there's not that many of them that will persist that long. But if you get into a situation where we tried one thing and it didn't work this spring, so we're going to start over and plant something else, make sure you got records of what you sprayed. If you used a pre-emerge, you might not be able to reseed that area. Okay, you might have to transplant, you might have to do something else, but persistence can come back to bite you. And that a persistent herbicide is not necessarily bad. If it's a pre-emerge, you want it to be persistent. You want it to stay there and keep weeds from coming up. But it can become a problem if you then try to reestablish or establish something new on that site, then that herbicide might bite you. Some herbicides can be present in the soil but don't really have an effect. Roundup's a good example. You put that herbicide out there, it doesn't just disappear. It has a half-life of something like 30 some odd days. But it gets bound up by the soil, so it's not available to the roots of the plant. But in certain situations, like a pure sugar sand, I've actually seen Roundup hurt plants from its soil activity. So it's actually going through the root of a plant that came in after the fact and took up some Roundup and killed it. That can happen. It's really, really rare, but it does happen from time to time. Under our conditions in this part of the state, herbicide persistence, residual activity is less of a concern because these materials, herbicides of almost any kind, at the end of the day, they get broken down by chemical processes or by biological processes. Could be bacteria, fungi, whatever in the soil that break them down at the end of the day. They like warm, wet conditions. So this is South Texas. It's at least warm most of the year. Sometimes it's wet through the winter. Herbicides tend to break down quicker here than they do elsewhere. But I go back to West Texas, it's fairly cold through the winter and very, very dry. Herbicides that would break down in a few months here might persist for over a year in Fort Stockton, Texas, because the breakdown process is much slower. But fairly forgiving here. Our soil texture can be a little bit of an issue. Heavy clay soils, these Victoria clays in this area, high organic matter, kind of acts as a sponge that might hold herbicide residues rather than letting it leach out. Also, high use rates. If you happen to put a material down with an improperly calibrated sprayer, or I hope this doesn't happen, but you didn't read the label and you just eyeballed it and you mixed it up, a herbicide that might be safe for next year's crop could turn into a real problem because you put too much of it out there. So the persistence is related to the amount that was applied. So if I put a double dose out there, it's going to be active in the soil for longer than it would have if it was applied at the right dose. So these are all important things to remember. Application equipment can be very, very simple. The backpack pump up sprayers are great. I don't have one of those at my house. I have the little 1.5 gallon jug that I got from Tractor Supply. I've had it 10 years. It probably cost me $20. You clean them out. Every time you use them, they last a long time. That works really, really well. Tow behind type rigs for your lawnmower or an ATV can work well if you've got some bigger areas to cover, but it's hard to beat a little pump up sprayer. There are some granular products out there, especially pre-emerges, that you might put out through a spreader. The little hand crank spreaders work well. You're familiar with those that you might tow behind a lawnmower for fertilizer application. It's the same equipment, but all works really well. The main thing is we want to make sure we're calibrated. Okay, we have to know how much total material we're putting out. If the label says I need to put out 6 ounces per 1,000 square foot, I need to put out exactly 6 ounces per 1,000. Some herbicides are not very forgiving. If I put out 8 ounces, I might actually hurt my lawn in some cases. If I put out 4 ounces, I may not kill the weed. So if the label says 6, you put out 6. The only way you know that is by calibrating your sprayer. This gentleman here, this is a golf course in College Station. You can see the car on the street. It's a pretty old photo, but there was a calibration issue there. The dose being applied was much higher than what they were supposed to, really uglied up this golf course, and he didn't stay employed there very long. So the dose makes the poison. Like I said, you put out too little, you wasted money, you didn't kill the weed. If you put out too much, you could hurt the plants that you like that would have been safe otherwise. So you have to know the output of that sprayer, and that depends on a lot of things. Depends on how fast you walk. If it's coming out from behind a lawnmower, how fast you drive. So the faster you drive, the less dose you're putting out. The slower, the more or the higher the dose you put out. Depends on your sprayer output. If I've got especially sprayers that have a pressure gauge on them, if I'm putting out 60 pounds per square inch or PSI versus 30, okay, 60 is going to put out more volume, going to get a higher dose. 30 is going to be low volume, lower dose. If you have the ability to regulate pressure on a sprayer, you want to be consistent so that you know you're putting out what you calibrated for. And then also the amount of, if you're spraying a liquid solution, the amount of herbicide that goes into the water portion in the tank. Once you know the output of the sprayer, you can then decide or determine exactly how much herbicide to put in the tank. We could talk a whole hour on this easily, like how to do it, how to go about it. I'm going to send you, well, I'm not going to send you, I'm going to show you here a place to go to find a good walkthrough on how to calibrate a sprayer. If you go to my website, it's in the notes that we sent out, or I think Vince's going to send those out. Basically, the version of these slides in like PDF. It'll have this link here where you go to ccag.tamu.edu/extension/soil and crop sciences. From there, you see the page here on the right-hand side. At the bottom, under other agronomic resources, there's a button there that says herbicide and spray equipment resources. There's 2 guides in there. One is for a boom or a boomless sprayer. That would be more for your larger acreage applications. The other of those is called pressurized sprayer calibration. And that's more geared towards your pump up type sprayers for smaller scale applications. But it walks you through the process of how to calibrate that sprayer and how to do the math so that you can put out an accurate amount. With the pump up sprayers, it's never an exact science, but if you'll follow the instructions there, you can get very, very close. Okay. Last couple of things before we start talking about different scenarios here. Pre-emerge versus post-emerge herbicides. I've mentioned pre-emerge products a few times now. That means something that prevents the weed from emerging from the soil. Pre-emerges don't prevent germination. Okay, the weeds have to germinate to take up the herbicide. All they do is prevent that seedling from, maybe it's making a root system, making a shoot, whatever, but you never see the weeds emerge from the soil. So that's kind of a protective barrier of herbicide that you might put down in your lawn or your garden. May or may not be systemic. Really, it doesn't matter at the end of the day with the pre-emerge. As long as it kills the weeds before they come up, that's okay. But pre-emerges across the board are going to require incorporation or activation. I'll explain that more here in a second. When you put a pre-emerge out, remember you're treating the soil. You're not treating plants. We want herbicide on the soil and eventually in the soil if a pre-emerge is going to work for us. The weed seed that you're going after is not sitting on the soil surface. It's typically going to be in that top inch or so of the soil profile. So we spray the herbicide over the top. Herbicide is sitting on the soil surface. We then have to activate or incorporate. In a tilled up garden, some pre-emerges you might incorporate, typically with like a rototiller. So you would spray the herbicide, and then you would come in with a rototiller and you would till it up, 2, 3, 4 inches down. And that basically takes that herbicide and mixes it into the soil. In more of your lawn and garden settings, we actually rely on water to move the herbicide into the soil. So you spray it or you spread it, could be a dry product, and then you turn the sprinkler on. And that sprinkler water washes it in, or a timely rain would do the same thing. But we have to have something that moves the herbicide into the soil. If I just spray it and I don't till it in, I don't water it in, it's not going to kill any weeds. It has to be present in the soil where that weed seed is. And the other important thing here is that pre-emerges are kind of selective by nature. If you've got established plants that already have a fully developed root system on them, we can use a pre-emerge all around those plants and have no real issue. Okay, so if I've got turf grass, established turf grass that's already covered over well enough, if I've got transplants that are going in a garden bed, I can use pre-emerges very safely because those transplants already have an established root on them. The pre-emerge is only hindering or harming those little weed seed that are weeds that are coming from a seed. They're newly germinating weeds that are about to emerge. The pre-emerge doesn't hurt that established root system. Post-emerge herbicides are those that you use after you see the weed. So the weed comes up, we decide we don't want it, so we spray it with something. Few key points here, because now you're running some risk. If you're spraying it over the top of some beneficial plants or desirable plants, we want to make sure we're doing this in a safe manner with the right product so that we don't hurt the plants we want. So post-emerge herbicides, we want to steer clear of them under really extreme conditions. We want to stay clear of your yard under transition. So early in the spring, we're coming from cool season grasses to our warm seasons. We don't have a lot of that seasonality down here, but further north, that can be a real sensitive time. When it's really hot, really dry, also not a good time to spray. With most herbicides, you really need healthy weeds to kill them, surprisingly. I can think of one exception to that, being prickly pear. But if you don't have good, healthy, active growth in the weed, you're probably not going to have good activity with the herbicide. And sometimes those conditions will lead to more injury to the plants that you like too. So again, healthy weeds are easier to kill. After you spray a herbicide, don't run the sprinklers immediately after that. Wait a day, 2 days. Most herbicides will have a rain fast interval on there. Could be 4 hours, 12 hours. It's easier to remember. Just don't water it for the next day or so. You don't want to wash the herbicide off. Give it a chance to work. You need a rain-free period of at least 4 to 6 hours for most products. Also, don't mow. Don't mow before immediately before or immediately after you spray, especially after you spray, because you just put herbicide, and it's probably expensive, on those weeds. If you come by with the mower the next day, you're removing most of that herbicide in that cut material. You need to give time for the herbicide to move into the part of the plant that will ultimately kill it. On occasion, especially with some of our tougher perennials, you might have to spray a few times sequentially. There are some species, especially in turf grass, that we really don't have great answers for, other than you spray every 2 or 3 weeks until it goes away. You're really not going to find too many species that fall into that category, but on occasion there are those that you're just not going to get in a single dose. Also remember, you might have to add a surfactant to a post-emerge herbicide, because plant leaves by nature are kind of waxy. They get more waxy as the summer progresses. If you're putting a water solution on a waxy surface like your car hood, it's going to beat up, so you're not going to get good coverage. Surfactants are kind of soapy in nature, and that helps that spray solution spread out. It also helps dissolve and soften the wax on the top of that leaf, so you get the herbicide into the leaf. For the small quantity, like homeowner type products you'll see on the shelf in like a big box store, a lot of those already have a surfactant in them. You still need to read the label and find out, but a lot of them will have them already packaged. The more commercial grade stuff, larger quantity type herbicides, more often than not, you have to add a surfactant in. Surfactants are cheap, but if the label says you need them, you really do need them. Okay, let's talk. Well, let me back up. Any questions on that before? Now we're going to talk ornamentals, vegetable gardens, turf. Hearing no questions.
Yeah, there's a bunch here.
Oh, a bunch.
On grass lawns, how do you get rid of Johnson grass?
Depends on your grass. In a Bermuda grass setting, I believe you have some options. I'd have to do a little research. I know in Bermuda grass pastures, I can kill Johnson grass, but the product names are going to be different. But I can do some digging on that and send it back to you, Vince.
Okay. Could a vinegar salt liquid dishwasher work as a natural herbicide?
Vinegar, salt, dishwasher. Yeah, and that's similar to, I've seen different variations on that, kind of homebrew type concoction. That can work well. The actual amount you mix up, or the concentration of those ingredients, varies quite a bit depending on where you go for that info. I've played with them a little bit around my house. It's a contact non-selective herbicide. So, you know, if you're trying to kill some annuals, you know, along a sidewalk, fence line, in a bed, away from desirable vegetation, it can work really well. That kind of mixture is not going to work on a perennial, and it's not something you want to spray over the top of, say, your whole lawn, right? It's going to burn it all. But they're non-selective, indiscriminate. They just burn the leaf tissue off.
Okay. How do you feel about hose-in sprayers?
The kind of where it injects it in the hose as you spray it, that can work pretty well, but in the hands of the wrong person, you can still mess it up. The hose in, basically, it's sucking active ingredient into the stream as it's exiting the hose. I've seen folks that will just sit there and hold that thing still, standing next to their tree, and yell at their kids, and they're putting a massive dose of whatever, it could be a fungicide, herbicide, what have you, out when they do that. You've got to keep the end moving. But that is, you know, it's not perfectly calibrated, but it's a step in the right direction with those type applicators.
How about pesticide, herbicides that affect the reproductive cycle?
I don't know a good way to affect the reproductive cycle other than to kill the plant. We've played with, in other settings, row crop settings, using materials to spray on the weeds to render the seed inviable or stop them from preventing viable seed. Really haven't found anything that works well. The best thing for interfering with the reproductive capacity is to kill the plant and just prevent it from ever having a chance at maturing that seed.
Do pre-emergent herbicides hurt established grass lawns?
No, and that's the great thing about, especially in a lawn setting, if you've got turf grass that's been in place for, say a year or so, and it's covered over well enough that you're happy with that stand, there's a lot of pre-emerges you can use at 0 to minimal risk. Only thing I would caution you with is, say, we just came out of that freeze in February, and I didn't see a lot of stand loss around here, but not too far north of here. We've got lawns that are kind of half dead. If they put a pre-emerge out earlier in that year, it took a lot longer for that stand to recover, because as that Bermuda grass or some other turf grass is trying to cover over with things like runners, those runners will try to root down at nodes along that length, and a lot of our pre-emerges prevent root growth. And so we saw a lot of areas that didn't recover for 5-6 months because there was a pre-emerge out there. But if you've got a good healthy stand, and the 1 in 50-year freeze event doesn't throw a wrench into your plans, it's very safe, very safe.
Okay.
But you don't want to use a pre-emerge if you're trying to get coverage in your stand of grass. You want to make sure you've already got the stand that you're happy with before you use the herbicide.
The herbicides, how do they select the weed that you're trying to get rid of and interrupt it? What is the process that it uses to do that? It
depends, and that's a really difficult question to answer, because there's 14, 15 different very unique modes of action, different ways that different herbicides actually kill a plant. They all inhibit different points in the physiology of the plant. So some, like in the example of most of your broadleaf killers that you would use in say a lawn, okay, broadleaf plants don't metabolize those herbicides very well at all, but grasses do. So in that case, grasses are very, very safe, whereas broadleaves are very sensitive. That's one example, but that's just with the synthetic auxins. There's a bunch of other different chemistries, different modes of action. And a lot of times it boils down to that specific species that is sensitive to that herbicide happens to have a pathway or an enzyme in just the right spot where that herbicide can really hammer it. Whereas sometimes a closely related species is just enough different that it's safe. So you're diving into really nitty-gritty details of plant physiology at that level.
Okay, that's all the questions that are on the chat at this time, directed to me.
Okay.
For you.
Yeah. Let's talk ornamentals, and we've got a few things we can use in an ornamental setting. Of course, hand removing, hand hoeing. That's going to be an option for virtually any setting. Mulches, landscape fabrics, basically, your tools to suppress weeds coming up through those materials, and then herbicides. We do have a few herbicide options. Mulches work well. I'm not necessarily the expert on proper mulching technique, but it's pretty simple at the end of the day. We do this with cover crops in our row crop settings from time to time. Basically, we're creating big, thick layer of something out there. It could be a mulch, it could be plant litter in the case of a cover crop. Either way, if it covers the soil, it's going to suppress weeds from coming up. It's not going to eliminate weed problems, but it's going to keep a lot of them at bay. Also helps insulate that soil a little bit, conserve soil moisture. Those are also good things to have on your side. But at the end of the day, a mulch is pretty simple. It's covering the soil. It's preventing things, especially like annuals, from coming up through that layer. Fabrics do the same thing. They get very, very expensive from what I understand on large scales, but can be really good for, your homeowner purpose.
Gosh, a question on like pine needles and sawdust. Don't those have some drawbacks, like the pine needles with the chemicals it releases?
Yeah, it can, and I'm probably not the best person to speak to what those leachates are, but we've done that with, you see it with live oak leaves. If they get accumulated in an area, you can get a leachate that'll come out of that with water that will prevent weeds from coming up. It can also hurt something that you're trying to establish there. I would imagine, pine, juniper, cedar, you would also get some leachates out of that. A lot of times it's tannins, but I'm not the best person to talk to on what the best mulch is, or those that don't have that problem. I'm pretty simple. It's just something to keep the weeds from coming up, but there can be some problems with what actually comes out of that mulch material. Now your fabrics, like we mentioned, pretty simple. You're suppressing weed growth by covering that soil. Okay, you're not allowing sunlight to reach the soil. That's one of the signals for those weeds to come up. So it works well. They're not permanent. There are plants that can come through a landscape fabric, especially as it wears over time. A lot of your sedges can penetrate materials that you put down. They come up, that seedling leaf on a sedge is needle sharp. It'll amaze you what it'll actually come through. So sometimes you can see that happen, but fabrics are going to be a little more durable, a little longer lasting than something like a mulch, but comes at more expense. And remember, it is not permanent at the end of the day. They do require replacement from time to time. Mechanical control, really not saying anything new here. Hand pulling, hand hoeing, tillage, they're all tools in your toolbox. Remember, if you're running a tiller through, you're probably going to see some new weeds flush in that tilled area. Just be prepared to handle them. But otherwise, mechanical methods work really well. Now, for herbicides in an ornamental setting, there's a few different scenarios we can exploit a herbicide. In the case of annual grasses, we can attack that from the pre-emerge and post-emerge standpoint, and we'll talk about specific herbicides in a second. Perennial grasses, we have some post-emerge options. With sedges, also post-emerge. With broadleaf weeds, that's more difficult to solve, because you're typically talking about broadleaves in your ornamental setting. That's often what you're planting, right? Or what I understand that you're planting or growing. So controlling a broadleaf weed in a broadleaf crop or a broadleaf desirable setting is more difficult, because there's not a good difference between those that we can exploit with a selective herbicide. For your pre-emerges, primarily you're relying on what we call the dinitroanilins, or the DNAs. These are also known as yellow herbicides. As you might guess, they're yellow. They'll stain your clothes, they'll stain your hands. You want to try to stay covered, stay protected as you're mixing them up. But this is an old group of chemistries. Pendulum that we mentioned when we were covering the herbicide labeling, that's one of them. Treflan, Surflan, Endurance, Team, there's a lot of different dinitroanilins out there. These are pre-emerges that are very grass specific. May control a few broadleaf species, typically only those that have very, very small seed. But primarily, this is going to be your ticket for annual grass control. Remember, you have to activate the herbicide, so water them in. Pretty safe over the top of established plants. Sometimes if leaves are wet and you spray a yellow herbicide over the top, it can cause a little bit of burning, so cosmetic damage. Not something you typically want to see in an ornamental setting, so try to stay off of wet foliage. Make sure your product matches the weeds that you're after, which again, in the case of these herbicides, it's mostly going to be your annual weeds or annual grasses. You can use them fall and spring, or fall followed by spring. So you catch your fall flush, you catch the next spring flush. But remember, herbicide resistance is a real thing. It's not something you often see in an ornamental setting, but if you're using the same herbicide a couple times a year, every year, it could conceivably lead to weeds evolving, basically. And we have seen that in row crops. So try to rotate your products as best you can. Unfortunately, in the case of, grass killer, annual grass killer, the DNAs are actually about your only option. Once the grasses come up, we have the option of using graminicides. So these are selective herbicides, selective for grasses. So you can spray a graminicide over the top of a broadleaf plant. So you could spray your whole garden. If it's all broadleaf ornamentals, you could spray a graminicide over the top to kill the grasses. It would be very safe on your desirable plants. Main two ingredients here are going to be sethoxydim or fluazafop. There's a number of different trade names of products that you might find those in. We call them the fops and the dims. There's a few other ingredients out there, but sethoxydim, fluazafop. When you see that ending on that common name or that active ingredient name, it's a graminicide. But these are, again, post-emerge. So after grassy weeds come up, we could use something like a graminicide. Can be used on any non-grass ornamental. Do not spray open blooms. Okay, the graminicides are oil-based. When we spray them over open flowers in row crops, especially, it'll cause those flowers to abort. Especially bad if you spray them in the morning and you got a little dew in there. Graminicides will not control nutgrass because nutgrass is a sedge. Nutgrass typically is nut sedge. Going back to what we said earlier, important that you know the difference between those two, because what looks like a grass may not actually be a grass. Also, it's an oil-based material. If you apply during extreme heat, really humid days, the combination of those two, we can see a little bit of burning on foliage. It's just cosmetic, but you can avoid that spraying under better conditions, milder conditions. All right, pre-emerge broadleaf control. Not too many options here. The only one I'm aware of is Gallery or isoxaben. It's going to control annual broadleaf weeds in your woody ornamentals. It does have some reseeding restrictions out there. Now, sedge problems are fairly easy to solve. We've got Bazagran, turf and ornamental, we've got Manage, and we've got Image. All three of those products can be used for a number of our sedge issues. Bazagran does not have purple nut sedge on the label, but it has yellow nut sedge and your annual sedges, and Manage and Image will control essentially any of the sedges that we're going to run into in this part of the state. So very, very effective for sedges, but these are selective for those plants. Vegetable gardens, we have much fewer options when it comes to herbicides, at least. So we have things like glyphosate or Roundup that we could use before planting, before an establishment, just to kill the existing vegetation, kill whatever weeds have come up before we establish. If you've got perennials out there, or you're not sure if you have perennials out there, you want to start that process well before you plant. Give it a couple of weeks. Do your preparation work, your tillage work, till that bed up, and then you're going to probably have another flush that you could then spray again before you plant. But you want to give enough time that you can get a full kill with something that might be a perennial if you spray it with Roundup. Another thing you can do if you're perhaps transplanting into some parts of the garden, keep those transplanted areas separate from the areas where you're establishing from seed. In a transplant situation, you could use a pre-emerge, in this case, Treflan, which is one of those yellow herbicides, around those transplants because they have an established root. If you mix them all up, you destroy that ability, that option. You can't use Treflan anywhere around what you're going to seed. But if you keep them separate, you can use herbicide to make this part of the garden easier to manage, and you're still going to have some handwork in those areas where you direct seed into the soil. At the end of the day, most of the horsepower in a vegetable garden is hand weeding. Hand weeding, pulling, chopping, whatever the case may be. Understand if you get really aggressive with it, you might be bringing some additional seed to the soil surface, but at the end of the day, that's the main tool you have. If you're doing spot spraying, and spot spraying is great, you could use that homebrew vinegar, salt, weed killer. If you've got perennials, you might use something like glyphosate. But remember, you always have some fine droplets that come out of that spray wand at the end of the day. You may not see them all the time, but a couple of days or a week after you spray, you tend to find out that, oh, we actually did drift a little herbicide onto the plants that we like. That's where these little spray shields do a lot of good. I've even used, I wish I had a Gatorade bottle around here, but I've used a Gatorade bottle in the past, a quart Gatorade bottle. I cut the bottom end off of it, and then I take the neck and I put it on my spray wand around the nozzle, and I duct tape it. So it makes a nice little cup that I can then place over the weed. I spray the weed. I know that there's no drift, blowing out of that area and getting onto the plants that I don't want to spray. Just a way to contain that spray and make sure it doesn't go somewhere it's not wanted. Really important to remember, and this is always the case, but especially in vegetable gardens, never use a herbicide that isn't labeled for that use. Run into this a few times where, my neighbor told me I could use this stuff at the farm and ranch store to spray my lawn or spray my vegetables. And number one, it's illegal. Sometimes it can be a train wreck from the safety aspect, from crop injury, whatever the case may be. Make sure it's labeled for use in that vegetable garden if you're using it in a vegetable garden on that species. Some herbicides can stay in that soil for a long time. If you use the wrong thing, you might not be able to plant that garden for a year or two. In the case of some of our range and pasture herbicides, a couple of years. That material can be active in the soil. And if it isn't labeled for, let's say, your garden, there's probably a really good reason for that. In most gardens, it's going to be residue issues going into the plant that might be immediately consumed, or it might be safety issues as far as, damage to the plant itself. So don't use things that aren't labeled. It's pretty simple at the end of the day. All right, we're going to wrap up on turf grass. A few more herbicides to talk about with turf grass than the other scenarios we just touched on. When you've got annual grasses in turf, specifically perennial turf, we can control that problem very easily with a pre-emerge. And we've touched on this a few times. If you've got an established turf grass stand out there, we have mature root systems already in the soil. So a pre-emerge is going to be very little, if any, risk, but it'll help us keep any annuals, be they grasses or broadleaves, from coming up. We use those dinitroanilins, those yellow herbicides, in turf quite a bit. They've been around for a long time. They work really well. They're very cheap. Pendulum is a great one. We've touched on it a lot of times today. Barricade, Surfland, Team, XL, those are all other dinitroanilins. They can be used for annual grasses. There's a few other options out there. I'm not terribly up to date on turf grass herbicides, but Dimension and Ronstar been around for a while. They could also be used for an annual grass issue. Remember, as long as you've got established roots on the plants you like, your turf grass, these are very safe. The yellow herbicides in Dimension work by preventing root formation. And so sometimes you'll see on your established turf, in that shallow zone of the soil, you may see some club roots in that top inch and a half, basically a root that tried to form, but then comes kind of malformed and blunt at the tip. That's not really hurting anything because your turf grass has a lot of root below that. It's going down many, many inches into the soil, but you may see a little bit of damage around the crowns. But if that kind of root malformation happens to a new seedling, it kills it, which is what you want. So your annual grasses can't form a root after they germinate, so they die. And so that's a good thing in a turf setting. Ronstar is a little different. It actually prevents the above ground portion of the weed from forming. It forms a root, but it can't form the shoot. And so it also dies before you ever see anything. Timing with the pre-emerge is everything. For your summer annual grasses, which is what most of us battle in this part of the state, it could be anywhere from New Year's Day to early March when you need to apply those materials. It depends. It depends completely on the weather. This year it was warm early. I had summer annuals up early in January. I thought I missed them. Then the big freeze happened in February and it hit a big reset switch on everything. And we got another chance to spray a pre-emerge. Most years around here, mid to late January through about Valentine's Day is when most of your summer annuals will start coming up. So you want to have a pre-emerge out well before that, so you have enough time to spray it and water it in, do all that stuff. If you're really close to the coast or like on the island, good luck, because your timing is really difficult out there. It just doesn't get cold enough, long enough to make these plants cycle like they should. But these grasses, just like any annual, they hit a certain soil temp, and if they've got moisture, they take off. So your crabgrass starts off about 55 degrees, goosegrass, barnyard grass about 60 degrees. When you see the farmers in this area planting corn, typically that's going to be their first crop to go in the ground. You better have put a pre-emerge out already if you have annual grasses in your yard, because corn's coming up in that, upper 50 to around 60 degree soil temp. That's when we're telling these guys to actually start planting.
I have some questions for you, Josh.
Yes, sir.
How deep do mulches have to be effective?
How deep?
Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, at the end of the day, all you have to do is cover the soil surface. So with a chopped up material, if you've got a couple of inches out there, that's doing the job. Now, as that weathers, you might want a thicker layer so it lasts longer as it weathers and starts to decompose. But as long as it's covering, you're fine. Whatever it takes to get there. Now, you don't want such a thin layer that, a dog walking through the bed is going to disturb and bring out some open soil. But I don't know what, an exact depth for that material you want to shoot for. But at the end of the day, it just has to cover the soil surface. Make sure you're not getting sunlight down to the soil.
Yeah, I think the reference material says 3 to 4 inches, and don't put it around the trunk, particularly of trees or branchy plants.
Yeah, everybody in my neighborhood likes to make that big mound of mulch around the base of their plants.
Yeah,
I don't know where that comes from.
That's a no-no.
Yeah.
Next question, will fabric restrict root growth and plant development?
Yes, which is why we would use it for weed control. Now, I think you're asking that around the desirable plants. If I'm
I think that's what Fred's referring to here.
Yeah.
Is going to affect the plants that you're trying to keep the weeds from growing up around.
No, it shouldn't. It shouldn't at all. Those are permeable substances, so you're getting water through it. All you're doing is preventing sunlight with the soil surface to discourage that newly emerging weed seedling. That is already growing up through the fabric. You're putting it down around, say, a shrub or a tree or whatever. It's got a root system down there. It's still getting water through that landscape fabric to the soil. So I don't see any issue there.
Yeah. What I would think, you may comment on this, is if you have a plant, as an example, I have a Siam tulip, which is actually a ginger, and it has rhizins that go out, and that's how it promulgates. So it might affect your promulgation
Oh, yeah.
of a rising plant that you're trying to get more plants from.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got anything that you want to see more spread out of, vegetatively or from seed, it doesn't matter, then you wouldn't want to have a landscape fabric around it. It's gonna inhibit suckers from coming up, rhizomes from sprouting, stolons from taking root, whatever the case may be. Landscape fabric doesn't know weed from crop in that case.
Okay, here's one that might be problematic to answer. Where is the best place to buy herbicides where you have the variety to cover most problems?
I don't know, to be honest with you, because I'm talking about a lot of herbicides that I don't actually deal with on a day-to-day basis under those trade names. So I know there's, commercial turf suppliers, commercial landscape suppliers that are probably going to have better stocks and more variety. I don't know locally who to go to because that's not what I use at home. Row crops, we use larger kind of distributors, but they're not going to sell the kinds of things that you're looking at for turf grass or ornamental. Vince, you probably have a short list of places that are kind of the go-to around here.
Well, I usually use the big box for general stuff, but if I'm not familiar with the problem, then I go to like Gills, where I can ask somebody that knows better than I do what to selectively purchase.
Yeah.
The next question is, will DNAs hurt succulents?
No. If they're already established, meaning they already have a root system underneath them that's penetrating well into the soil, dinitroaniline will not do anything to them. And I don't know that they'd even do anything from seed, to be honest with you, but definitely not if they're established.
Okay. Here's one that interests me because I have used this. Is using a propane torch on post-emergent weeds effective? Will it kill perennials?
Not in many cases that I can think of would it kill a perennial. But for annuals, absolutely. I've been doing this over the weekend at my place with a blowtorch on the end of a PVC stick. I've got some big annuals and it's dry enough out in Calallen where I can't pull them very easily. So I've been sticking a torch down in the middle of the crowns. It's a big annual grass that I'm battling. But as long as you get enough heat into every bit of that crown as it comes out of the ground, you don't have to burn the whole thing down, by the way. You just have to get that bit coming out of the ground. Maybe it's a few tillers on a grass or a stem or two on a broadleaf. Get those cooked and that plant's done. The top may still be green, but it's not, the vascular tissue is destroyed. That works for an annual. For a perennial, unless you have nothing to do all day but just sit there and hold that torch to the soil, you're not going to get the soil hot enough to kill those structures below ground. Sometimes you're looking, some of these sedges, it could be 6, 8, 10 inches below ground where you actually have to kill that tuber. Fire isn't going to get you there. So you're looking at digging it up or using a herbicide. But for annuals, absolutely. Fire works just fine.
Yeah, what I find is very effective is for killing the seeds where you have the ones that like to fly all over the place, or the ones that have hundreds of seeds on a stalk. You can burn those seeds and they don't drop into the ground and germinate.
Yep.
That's where I find it pretty effective.
Yeah, and also if you have seed in that thatch layer on the soil surface, those can be burned too. Once the seed actually gets into the soil at essentially any depth, you really can't touch it with fire at that point. It just takes too long to get that heat into the soil. But as long as it's sitting above the soil, it doesn't take heat for very long to devitalize that seed, if not burn it up completely. So yeah, fire's it's fun too. my girls like watching it. So it's another tool.
What is the best use to kill ponyfoot weeds and Zuri soil lawns? I'm sorry. So
I'm not familiar with what ponyfoot is.
Okay, let's see. Who is this? iPhone. I think that's Mary Helen. Mary Helen, can you clarify what a ponyfoot is? And let's see.
Okay. It's zoysia grass, first of all. So it's a turf grass, not St. Augustine. And it in places where water, like when we have these heavy rains, we'll end up with these little round circular weeds. And when I took a picture of it and did my picture ID, it called it ponyfoot. It looks like a hoof of a horse, like a pony's hoof. And it's shiny and green, and it actually is planted around ponds or places where you have water features, but it's coming up in our turf, in our grass.
I think you're describing a broadleaf weed, and I'm not familiar with a lot of the weeds that you're going to encounter, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a broadleaf in your zoysia grass, and so I would be looking at those general broadleaf killers on the shelf, Home Depot, and I'm going to talk about them here in just a second. Actually, the specific ingredients, that would probably be your first stop. Just try one of those. They're cheap. They're very safe on your grass.
Okay.
And give that a try to start off with. I'm just not familiar. It maybe dichondra. There's a
I think it's a dichondra.
Yeah, and those can be kind of tough, but eventually you can get them with a 2,4-D dicamba broadleaf killer. That Home Depot, Lowe's would have multiple options for you.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about those here in just a second too.
All right.
Any other questions, Vince?
No. Alfred put it here. Nailers. They're like Tractor Supply. They're out for navigation and Agnes. They carry a lot of stuff that you can't get elsewhere.
Yeah.
Let's see, what's this here? Glyphosate, GLY phosphates.
Glyphosate, I think, is what they're trying to say.
Will it do a dollarweed?
Dollarweed. Again, we're getting into weed species that I don't deal with, but glyphosate's cheap enough. I would just go ahead and give it a try on dollarweed. I know the species that you're talking about. I haven't dealt with it. I would just give it a try.
Yeah, dollarweed tends to grow in very sandy soils. It's very hard to get rid of because it's got the rhizome and the tubulas that it leaves behind. So pulling it up doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's where you would really want something like glyphosate to get into that root system. But it's non-selective, so it's in the middle of your turf. You're going to make a big dead spot. So that's kind of a hard deal to solve, but I would imagine it would have activity on that species though.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna decease on the questions because we're at 8:34.
Do I need to speed this up?
I don't know how much more you got. A couple of minutes, 10 minutes or so.
I can do that. We're going to hit the high points.
Okay. Unless the class, anybody want Josh to shorten his presentation? You can just drop out and we just let Josh take whatever time he needs. If you need to go, you can go ahead and drop out and take your 2 hours, for your class as your required time. If you want to stay in to get it the benefit of his knowledge.
Okay.
But before they leave, Josh, let me just make a statement. So if anybody bows out, they don't miss it. For you guys, we're 1/3 of the way through the course. Okay, we're at the end of August. So you got September, October. There's only one week in November, and then you take the exam. That's a 100-question exam with 25 2-page essay questions. I see some smiles. Nobody's worried about the exam. I can't scare you on it. Well, okay. But anyhow, looking at hours, you should be at least a third of the way through or better on getting the hours you need to get to be fully certified at the end of this course. If you are not getting those hours, you need to work on things to get those hours. If you would like to volunteer for some project that we have, and we have numerous projects you can work on, and these are on your own time. You pick when you work on it. Most of it, you can work on it from home. And you can get across multiple project areas to get those hours to satisfy the requirements, because you can't take hours in one area to satisfy your 50 hours of volunteer service. Remember to go to your membership policies and procedures. It tells you what are the required areas you must get hours in, or so many hours in those areas, and then you're free to get hours where you want. We're pretty creative when you're working on these projects, where you can cross across several projects and even get some CE hours on it. So contact me if you're willing to work on some volunteer programs. This will get you involved in the organization. And it's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to do it. Okay. You can talk the talk, but until you've walked the walk, you can't really talk the talk. Okay. And when you try and apply these things that we do, you really need to walk the walk. And this is a way to do it. Volunteer to take on a project under supervision and get your hours and learn about a specific area that may interest you. Okay, I'm gonna turn it back over to Josh. Remember, if you need to bow out, go ahead and bow out. I've already taken the attendance.
Okay. So let's move to perennial grass weeds. Remember, we're talking about management and turf. At the end of the day, perennial grass in a perennial grass, right? Most of your lawns are going to be perennial grass species. That's difficult to control. They're so alike. We don't have differences there that we can exploit. Mowing isn't terribly effective by itself. Pre-emerge herbicides will not control plants that are coming from rootstock. So your weeds that were already there the prior year that come back the next spring, they look like a new plant, but they're not. They have a established root on them already. A pre-emerge herbicide will not control that problem. And post-emerge herbicides are essentially non-existent. So not a lot of options here. We used to have something called MSMA. They could be used in lawns. We used it in pastures too. It was really, really good, but it's gone now. It's illegal. You sometimes will run into folks that still have MSMA in their garage. If you have any, don't apply it. We're well past the grace period on MSMA. It was in 2014 when you could still apply old stocks of that material. It's an organic arsenic, basically, that accumulates in the soil over time. It's not nice stuff to be putting out in your lawn where, you know, kids and grandkids are playing. So it was a good herbicide, but really bad from the environmental standpoint afterwards. So there's a few herbicides we can use to fill in some of those uses. of MSMA, Vantage or Envoy in centipede grass, Acclaim Extra in Fusillade can be used in zoysia, but both of these are really size specific. So you want to try to catch emerged grasses when they're very little, very early. They're not as good as MSMA was, but they are an option for you, but only, again, this is centipede and zoysia. So we don't really have a herbicide that's come around that has taken the place of that old herbicide. Annual broadleaf weeds, that's a lot easier. We already touched on that. It's a broadleaf and a grass crop. There's a lot of things we can do pre-emerge and post-emerge. Perennials, again, we have to rely on a post-emerge herbicide. But fortunately, there's a lot of products out there. Post-emerge, we have what we call the growth regulators or auxin herbicides, also sulfonylureas. We'll mention those in a little more detail here in a second. Pre and post-emerge, we have things like atrazine and simazine. You know, in St. Augustine, there's not a lot of post-emerge herbicides you can use, but atrazine is fairly safe and can be used for broadleaf control. Pre-emerge only, there's still the option of using Gallery as a strict pre-emerge. Luckily, for most broadleaf weeds in your grass lawn, the cheapest and easiest way to go about it is just to spray them as they come up, because there's a lot of products out there. So when you go to Home Depot, Lowe's, whatever, you're going to notice a lot of things on the shelf that say broadleaf killer. And if you look at the active ingredients, you're going to see a lot of the same ingredients in different combinations, usually 3- and 4-way mixes of different things. More often than not, they're going to have 2,4-D, MCPA, dicamba, clopyralid, triclopyr, a few other things. These are all the growth regulating herbicides. Basically what they do is they mimic growth hormones in the plant. And in the case of broadleaf species, they're very sensitive to that overdose in this auxin or this growth hormone, and it causes that plant to grow in a really uncontrolled fashion and eventually kills it. Very safe on grasses though. You're also going to see different formulations of those ingredients. It could be amines, esters, some with one ingredient that the next product doesn't have, but they're all kind of similar to me at the end of the day. They're all broadleaf killers. This is what a broadleaf weed looks like after you spray them. With those materials, again, it's mimicking a growth hormone. That plant just received a massive overdose of that growth hormone, and it's twisting and curling and growing in a kind of funny fashion, and that's causing imbalances elsewhere in the plant that will eventually kill it. But very, very safe on grasses. Grasses can metabolize those materials away. There are some tough broadleaves out there. Spreading dayflower, Asiatic dayflower. It looks like a grass. It's not. It's a broadleaf. Virginia buttonweed are a few that I'm familiar with that typically those off-the-shelf broadleaf killers, they're not going to solve these problems in a single application. But if you stay after them, don't let those weeds recover in between treatments, but repeatedly apply 2, 3, 4 weeks apart. Make sure you're not applying more than what you're allowed for the year. The label will tell you that. But you can oftentimes take these weeds out, but you might have to spray 2 or 3 times over the course of the year. Sedges, nut sedges specifically in a lawn, we have a lot of options. One of the best trade names I've run into is Sedgehammer. Beautiful product name. It tells you what it does. Okay, it's a sulfonylurea. You can use it in Bermuda, Centipede, Zoysia, St. Augustine. Certainty, sulfosulfuron, controls sedges along with some broadleaves in Bermuda, Centipede, St. Augustine, and Zoysia. And then Monument, which is another sulfonylurea, controls perennial ryegrass in addition to nut sedges, and it's only for Bermuda and Zoysia. These are all sulfonylureas that are very, very active on nut sedges. And you'll notice those active ingredients, they all end with URON. a lot of your more modern turf herbicides contain ingredients that kind of sound the same. Sulfosulfuron, 4-amsulfuron, rimsulfuron. This is a group of chemistries that really reached popularity, 80s and 90s. And the cool thing about them is also kind of the touchy thing about them. So, older herbicides like 2,4-D or atrazine, we might apply at rates of a pint or a quart per acre. These herbicides we might apply at an ounce per acre or a tenth of an ounce per acre. Very, very, very tiny amounts, which means you better calibrate accurately. Okay, you better be able to measure out material accurately, especially if you're applying in a lawn on a 1,000 square foot basis. And also these materials are active at very, very low doses. So you need to be careful with them. The selectivity of these sulfonylureas is also kind of wacky. Some of them are sedge products like we just talked about. Some only kill grasses, some only kill broadleaves, some only kill certain species. They're hard to predict as far as what they'll do without getting in and actually reading the label. And basically, these starve the plant as time goes on. It inhibits an enzyme that is only found in plants that basically prevents the formation of 3 amino acids, isoleucine, leucine, and valine. And if that plant can't produce those amino acids, eventually it can't produce proteins that it needs to produce to stay alive and continue growing, and the plant will starve itself to death. The symptomology with those is going to be, over a period of 2 to 3 to maybe even 4 weeks. They're slow-acting herbicides, but eventually that plant, if it's sensitive, will turn yellow in the terminal and the top of it, sometimes kind of a purple tinge, and then slowly die. This is different than, say, Roundup. Okay, you spray Roundup, the weeds are going to be dead in about 7 days. The vinegar solution, if you spray that within a couple of days, that plant's going to look fried. With these sulfonylureas, give them some time. And those weeds need to have good soil moisture, plenty of sunlight. They need to be healthy and actively growing. And it might be 3 weeks down the road before they start to turn and look sick, but that's just the nature of those products. Again, slow acting, soil activity is all over the board. Some have soil activity, some don't. This is the biggest group of herbicides that we have today. There's, 60, 70 different versions out there. So good products. We use them a lot in turf. They all kill weeds in a similar fashion, but they all differ in slight ways from one another. At the end of the day, the main point I want to get across here is these herbicides are active at really, really small amounts, and they're very water soluble. And so we do see this happen from time to time. If you've got runoff water moving from your lawn into, say, your vegetable garden or your ornamentals or whatever the case may be, remember, this stuff might move with that runoff water, and it's potentially toxic at very low doses by the nature of these herbicides. And you can see movement show up downstream. This is coming off of a fringe area on a golf course, moving into the rough, but you can see where water funneled down in here and move this, water and herbicide with it. And now we've got, looks like some thinning and some clover there. If it's all grass, it probably wouldn't have been a problem. But if you got some broadleaf and that broadleaf herbicide moves, or vice versa, you're using a sulfonylurea for grasses in your, say, your ornamentals, and it moves into your lawn, it could be an issue. But typically it's movement out of turf where you see these SUs. That's where we tend to use most of them. So with that, I know we've gone over time. Here's a few other resources. I've got a few things on my website that we touched on earlier, but it's more row crop based. Aggie Horticulture is a great place to go. More so now. Here in the last 2 or 3 years, they've really revamped that website. Publications.tamu.edu, that's soil and crop science. It's my department, but we have some good weed guides and also how herbicides work, how to mix a sprayer, how to calibrate a sprayer. You can find those things there as well. And then the Aggie Turf website is fantastic for all things turf. And that bit link at the bottom, I should have updated that. That goes to a website that no longer exists anymore. We have a new one. That's the one I showed you earlier on the sprayer calibration. That's the place to go for my website.